All right. Good morning, everyone. Sorry we had to switch to Zoom this morning, but I'm glad you're all here. So we are in Genesis 46 and 47, and hopefully my internet will work for us. So here we go. All right. Today's lesson is a beautiful picture of God at work. These two chapters are chock full of evidences of God moving and working to prepare Israel to become a great nation in the land of Egypt. From the very beginning, God chose Israel to be his chosen nation. And as we learned on Sunday, God chose them simply because he wanted to, not because of anything they did or would do, but because he loved them. From the very beginning, God had a plan of who he would use and how he would use them to lead, bless, and grow this family into a great nation that eventually would bring forth the Messiah to save and bless people from every nation and tongue. God is sovereign, and God was at work in the lives of Jacob, Joseph, and Pharaoh to prepare this chosen family to become a great nation. In today's lesson, we will see three main ways that God was working to prepare Israel to become a great nation. First, we will see how God prepared Jacob to leave Canaan. We'll see why it was a big deal for him to leave, how Jacob showed great faith, and how God comforted Jacob as he left Canaan, and then how God provided for Jacob as he left Canaan. Second, we'll see how God prepares Israel to enter Egypt. We'll see how God uses both Joseph and Pharaoh to prepare and provide for Israel as they enter Egypt. And lastly, we'll see how God provides for Israel to flourish and grow by blessing Pharaoh and the nation of Israel, and how he rewards Jacob for his faith. But before we dive in, I want to talk real quick about why Egypt was so important to the nation of Israel. Egypt's going to be the place where God protects Israel from extinction and from being corrupted by their neighbors, as well as a place where they are able to grow and flourish into their own nation. Hughes compares Egypt to the ark, to Noah's ark. For just as the ark provided salvation and preservation for Noah's family, Egypt, or specifically the land of Goshen, will provide salvation and preservation for Jacob's family. God needed to pull Israel out of Canaan to not only protect them from extinction, from the famine, and to protect them from becoming influenced and integrated with the people of Canaan, but also to allow Canaan to take their sin to the logical consequences and therefore be prepared for God's judgment through the invasion of Israel. I'm going to turn real quick here to Genesis 15, when God was speaking with Abraham, verses 13 to 16. It says, then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So if you see, it said the sins of the Amorites were not yet complete, had not yet reached its full measure. So Israel needed to be able to grow and flourish, to develop as a nation in a place where they were isolated enough to remain religiously pure, and yet remain physically protected and provided for so that they could grow and flourish, while the Amorites were left to their own sinful path until God was ready to bring their judgment and Israel's return. Later in Exodus, we find how God uses Egypt to provide trial and difficulty to draw Israel to himself and teach them how to depend on him for their strength and hope. But today, we will see how God prepares them to move into Egypt, into their ark, and how God prepares them to flourish. So let's begin first by reading the last few verses we studied last week in chapter 45. So we're going to start at verse 25 in chapter 45. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. So we see in this section that Jacob at first did not believe his sons when they told him Joseph was alive and ruling Egypt. But once he saw the carts and the things Joseph had sent to bring them back, he believed and was willing to go. Now, I want to take a minute to reflect upon how big a decision that was for Jacob. It has like one sentence about it, so he decided to go. But it really was a big deal for him to decide to go. Choosing to leave Canaan and go to Egypt was a huge step of faith on Jacob's part. So I have 4 reasons why Jacob leaving Canaan was a big deal and an act of faith. The first one was Jacob's family has a bad history with Egypt. If you remember, Abraham went to Egypt and lied about Sarah being his wife. And so this brought humiliation and disgrace upon Abraham. We also learned in Genesis 26:2 that Isaac had been forbidden by God to go down into Egypt. And so it took some faith for Jacob to realize that he could go down, and he prepares to move into Egypt himself. Secondly, we see it was a step of faith because going to Egypt meant leaving the promised land. His family was currently living in the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob himself. He had already left the land once, and he worked really long and hard to get back to his family and back to the promised land. So going to Egypt meant leaving this precious land that they were promised with, at that time, seemingly no guarantee that they'd come back necessarily. Third, he may have known and he may have remembered the part of God's covenant with Abraham that his family would be strangers in a land not their own and be enslaved for 400 years before being brought out and returned to the promised land. If he remembered this promise, it would take a lot of faith to leave knowing that what may lay ahead for him and his family. And lastly, Jacob knew that his life was almost over, and he knew that by leaving the promised land, he would die in a foreign country outside of the promised land. The land he worked so hard to return to, he would die outside of. And yet, Jacob chooses to step out in faith and sets out for Egypt. And as we see in verse 1, when he reaches Beersheba, he stops to offer sacrifices to God. Can
I interrupt you real quick?
Yeah, please.
Go over those 4 fill-ins for us real quick.
Yeah. So first, his family had bad history in Egypt. Second, he was leaving the promised land. Third, he may have known what lay ahead of him. And fourth, he would be dying outside of the promised land. Thanks, Em. So he stops when he's leaving, he reaches Beersheba and stops to offer sacrifices to God. By stopping to offer sacrifices here, we see great faith in Jacob. He's definitely not the same man we first met back in Genesis 27. The man who was rash and tried to do everything on his own. This time, Jacob stops to seek God's guidance on their long journey and makes one last offering to the Lord before they leave the land of Canaan. But why did Jacob stop here at Beersheba? First, there's a lot of family history at this spot. This is the spot where Abraham first made a covenant with Abimelech, named the place Beersheba, planted a tree, and called on the name of the Lord back in Genesis 21. This is also the place where Abraham's faith shone brightest when he was willing to sacrifice Isaac near here in Genesis 22. After that time, he went to Beersheba after he after they were up on the mountain. It was also the place where Isaac was assured 3 times by the Lord that God was with him in Genesis chapter 26. And lastly, we see in Genesis 28:6 that Jacob himself lived here in Beersheba in the early days before he journeyed back to Haran to meet up with his family. So there's lots of rich history between Jacob's family and God here in Beersheba. But Beersheba not only had so much rich family, it also was the edge of the promised land. So it served as a great spot to offer one last sacrifice before leaving the promised land. No one would enter this land again from their family, except for the short trip to bury Jacob later, until they take back the promised land and claimed it as their own in 400 years. This is the last sacrifice made in the promised land for 400 years. Hughes puts it very succinctly. He says, Beersheba's history, plus its being on the edge of the land, plus the momentous action of Jacob leaving the land that God had promised to Abraham and Isaac, plus fears of what could happen in Egypt, drove Jacob to God. And as we keep reading, we see that God rewards Jacob's faith and reliance upon him by showing up and offering encouragement to Jacob. So if you didn't catch it, the fill-ins were he had lots of family history there in Beersheba, and it was the edge of the promised land. So would someone mind reading Genesis 46 verses 2 to 4 for me, so you don't only have to hear my voice?
What was the verses again?
Just 2 to 4.
Okay. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob, here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes.
Thanks, Sam. So God, he not only hears Jacob, but he shows great kindness to Jacob by speaking to him, and he gives him 6 things to offer him comfort and confidence in his journey forward. First, God identifies himself as God, the God of your father. God himself is the greatest comfort he could give, and he specifically refers to himself as the God of Jacob's father to remind Jacob and reiterate the promises that God had made to Abraham and Isaac. Secondly, God tells him not to be afraid to go down to Egypt. God is encouraging him not to be afraid and giving him permission or instruction to go to Egypt. He now can have the confidence that this is indeed what God has for him and his family to do. He's not making some big mistake. God shows great kindness towards him by giving him permission to go. Third, God promises to make them into a great nation there. God is reiterating the promise he first made to Abraham in Genesis 12:2, then reiterated that promise to Abraham upon the promise of Isaac's birth in 17:19. And then he repeated that promise again to Abraham through the angelic guests who visited him in 18:18. And now he's reiterating it to Jacob with the fresh revelation that not only would God make their family into a great nation, but he would make them into a great nation in Egypt. So God not only comforts him with his own presence, he tells him not to be afraid to go down to Egypt and promises to make them into a great nation in Egypt. But God, being so gracious and loving, doesn't leave it at that, which would be enough comfort in and of itself. He goes on to promise that he will go down to Egypt with them. He's not sending them there alone, but going along with them. This is the 4th time we hear that God has promised Jacob he would be with him. So God first promised Jacob to be with him in Genesis 28:15. So I want to read it to you. God says, all right, this is Jacob's dream at Bethel when the ladder and the angels ascending and descending. And so I'm going to read verses 12 to 15. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So the first time God speaks to Jacob and promises to be with him was when he was leaving, going to Laban's. He also, the second time we see is in he promises him again he would be with him in 31:3. When he's now fleeing from Laban's house, fleeing Laban, the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. And then again in 35:1-3, Jacob says, when he's returning to Bethel, God said to Jacob, go up to Bethel and settle there and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you before you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go up to Bethel, where I build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and who has been with me wherever I have gone. And so we see that God has been with Jacob. He was with Jacob and told him he was with him in Mesopotamia, in Canaan, and now he tells him he will be with him in Egypt as well. What a comforting promise to know that God is not limited to the land of Canaan, but will be with them even in Egypt. But God's loving kindness still did not end there. He promises him that he will not only go with him to Egypt, but will also bring them out of Egypt and back to the promised land. So now we know that here, when God says bring you back to the promised land, he's not specifically meaning Jacob, but Jacob's family. Jacob is the representative of the entire clan. And so God is promising to be with Jacob's family in Egypt and promising to bring his family back to the promised land. So this is taking away the fear of leaving and missing out on his family getting to be in the promised land. And then lastly, God in his great kindness brings Jacob probably the greatest comfort he could give him by promising him that Joseph will be with him to close his eyes when he dies. God is promising Jacob that he will see Joseph again. What has Jacob's greatest fears been? That he would die an unhappy, miserable man. And yet, here God is promising him he will die peacefully reunited with his long-lost son. Oh, what a great and compassionate God we serve, right? He meets Jacob in his distress, and he just showers him with all these different promises and comforts and peace and confidence as he uproots his entire family and moves everything they have out of the promised land and into Egypt for the long haul. Jacob finally is acting in faith, and he's trusting in the Lord, and he goes to God for guidance, and God rewards him with great peace and comfort. So I'll just go over those real quick if you didn't catch them all. He calls himself the God of his father Jacob. He tells Jacob not to be afraid to go to Egypt. He promises to make them a great nation there in Egypt. He promises to go down with them. And he promises to bring his family out of Egypt and back to the promised land. and he promises Joseph will be there to close his eyes when he dies. So then the next morning, Jacob wakes up and he heads for Egypt. Would someone read verses 5 to 7 for me?
Then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob, their father, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, all his offspring he brought with him into Egypt.
Thank you, Donna. So Jacob sets off with all of his family and all of his possessions to the land of Egypt, fully assured and comforted that God will be with them. It is interesting to see the parallel that just as Noah took his whole family and all their possessions into the ark to be saved and protected, here it states how Jacob takes all of his family members and all their possessions into Egypt to be saved and protected as well. Here we already see God using Pharaoh to bless and provide for this family as they use the carts he sent to help carry them into Egypt. As Deb reminded us last week, these carts were a huge blessing as they were kind of a new invention or a fancy thing that not something anyone would just have access to. So to have these carts to carry them and all their stuff was such a huge blessing from Pharaoh, making them move that much easier on them. So God provided for them and blessed them as they left Canaan and began their trek to Egypt. As we continue reading, we see that Moses makes sure to document exactly who went into Egypt to be able to clearly compare how many came out of Egypt, clearly documenting God's blessings and making his blessing to make Israel a great nation in Egypt, just as he promised. So I'm going to take a quick moment and read through all these names listed of those who entered Egypt with Jacob. So we're at verse 8. These are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his descendants, who went to Egypt. Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob. The sons of Reuben, Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah, Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. But and Onan had died in the land of Canaan. The sons of Perez, Hezron, and Hamul. The sons of Issachar, Tola, Puah, Jashub, and Shimron. The sons of Zebulun, Sered, Elon, and Jaleel. These were the sons Leah bore to Jacob in Paddan Aram, besides his daughter Dinah. These sons and daughters of his were 33 in all. The sons of Gad, Zephon, Hagi, Shuni, Esben, Eri, Aradi, and Areli. The sons of Asher, Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, and Beriah. Their sister was Sarah. The sons of Beriah, Heber, and Malchiel. These were the children born to Jacob by Zilpah, whom Laban had given to his daughter Leah, 16 in all. The sons of Jacob's wife Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. In Egypt, Manasseh and Ephraim were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. The sons of Benjamin, Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gurah, Naaman, Ehi, Rosh, Muppim, Huppim, and Ard. These were the sons of Rachel who were born to Jacob, 14 in all. The sons of Dan, Husham. The sons of Naphtali, Jeziel, Guni, Jezer, and Shillem. These were the sons born to Jacob by Bilhah, whom Laban had given to his daughter Rachel, 7 in all. All those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. With the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt, the members of Jacob's family which went to Egypt were 70 in all. It's a lot of names. So Now, there are a few things to note in the list of names. First, you can see that they're listed by their mothers. First, Leah's kids, and then her servant Zilpah, then Rachel, and then her servant Bilhah. Now, I'm not sure why they're listed this way rather than just by birth order. I could not find much said about this, but I thought it was very interesting fact. You also will see that both Leah and Rachel bear twice as many descendants as their maids. Leah has 33, Zilpah has 16. Rachel has 14, and Bilhah has 7. Once again, not really sure why, but interesting fact. Also, if you try to do the math, there's some discrepancy trying to make it equal 70. But everyone agrees that it was kind of just rounded to 70 to make a nice round number. We see later when they're leaving, the number they give for them leaving Egypt was rounded as well, not including every specific number. So it's just to kind of give a nice general idea. And we do see at least 3 times in the Bible, it's listed that there were 70 people who entered Egypt first here, then in Exodus 1:5, and then again in Deuteronomy 10:22. There might be other times, but those are the times I found. It's at least 3 times listed 70 people. There are lots of interesting things we can notice about this list, but unfortunately, I was not able to find very much concrete. And no one really dove into the names or why they were the names, why there were some daughters listed, or why it said the Canaanite woman. I don't really know. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't really want to add too much of my own opinion on the matter. But the biggest thing to note is that they made it very clear who went into it and that there were about 70 of them so that we know when they left how much bigger they had grown. God makes sure there's no doubt that he fulfilled his promise to Jacob, that he was able to make this small family into a great nation while they were sojourning in the land of Egypt. So next, we're going to read about Jacob's reunion with Joseph, verses 28 to 30.
Just real quick about
go ahead.
About the sons of Levi. Those are probably the ones that are mentioned most often in the rest of the Torah, because we have a lot of description later about the role of the Levites, and they're broken down into these 3 sons. So the Levites are divided. The Gershonites do this, the Kohathites, whatever, do this, and it's interesting to me that these sons were born in Canaan, or born in the promised land, and they go to Egypt, and the families are still divided that way, and that God goes back all the way to the sons of Levi and says, this is how I'm going to make the priestly assignments, even though they had been dead for who knows how long by the time these roles actually start to take place during the time of Moses. And so God I feel like is already giving hints to, and Moses is giving hints to the people, you're about to read about what your jobs are going to be, and remember, these are where you come from. And it's so interesting to me that God is we're very close still to the stories of what Levi did and how terrible he was, and yet they're hearing, and remember, you're his descendants, and you're going to be the ones who are interceding between God and the people. And it's just really interesting to me that God redeems the sons of Levi, even though their father was this murderous, horrible person. And immediately we find out, no, these are the ones who are going to be interceding for the rest of the people, between them and God.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thanks, Em. I didn't really know all that. So thank you so much for sharing that. It is interesting. I love learning how all those little facts of how God works and God remembers and reminds us of everything. It's really cool. Does anyone else have a comment?
I think we have a clue here. Emily had asked me about when Judah and Tamar had gotten together. I think in verse 12, we see that by that time, Tamar's son and Judah's son already has kids himself. So I think you were right, Em, last week when you said that was pretty early on in the time, when we were talking about God restoring and convicting the brothers. And that probably just happened right there at when they were before Joseph, when they were finally convicted, because by this time, Judah and Tamar, that was, at least years, maybe 20 years before, because he already had grandchildren through them. So just a hint, we don't know anymore, but yeah, sorry, tangent, but that was from last week's lesson. And when I read that, I was like, oh, that's what Emily was asking. All right,
No,
enough.
great. That's great. Thank you, Deb. For sure. I thought it was interesting that Perez is the only one mentioned of his kids. And I can't imagine that he's the only child that has kids, but maybe he is. I don't know. It was interesting. So, all right. So does someone want to read verses 28 to 30 for us?
I will.
Thanks, Deb.
Now he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive."
Thank you. So we now begin the second section of the 2 chapters here, where we see God is now preparing Israel to enter Egypt. As we continue reading, we first see God using Joseph to prepare his family to enter and dwell in Egypt. And the first thing God does is reunite Jacob and Joseph. And then he uses Joseph to escort them into Egypt and lay the foundation with Pharaoh to ensure their best interest and provision for their dwelling in Egypt. So after we've read about all the people going with Jacob into Egypt, we see that Jacob sends Judah ahead to get directions to Goshen. Note, once again, we're now seeing Judah acting as the firstborn going ahead to prepare the way, and not Reuben. Judah is officially the spokesperson for his family now. When they arrive, Joseph comes in his chariot with all his fineries and probably an entourage of servants to meet them. It must have been quite the sight for Jacob to see his long-lost son with such position, power, and extravagance. And yet Joseph doesn't strut his power or show off. He collapses on his father and he weeps. Side note, in my Bible commentary, it says Joseph is sensitive and emotional and wept often. And I thought it was very humorous that they felt the need to note that he wept often. Like it was a grand thing. So anyways, just thought I'd share that with you all. So, but the point stands, Joseph is overcome with joy and emotion that he holds on to his father and he weeps for a long time. We don't really know how long they stood there weeping, but we know it's long enough to be noted that it was a long time. It had been 22 years since they last saw each other. And Joseph has only known that Joseph was alive for a very short while. So there's much joy and relief in embracing each other once again. And Jacob then tells Joseph, "I'm ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Jacob is able to finally have peace and rest, knowing that Joseph is alive and well. Although he's still focused on his dying, what a contrast to the fear and mourning he has talked of death all along before. He is finally at peace and he is well again now that he has seen Joseph. So now I'm going to read the next big section from 31 until 47:12. So Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to," just getting ready to that. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household, who were living in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, "What is your occupation?" You should answer, "Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did." Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." They also said to him, "We have come to live here a while because the famine is severe in Canaan and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now, please let your servants settle in Goshen." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen, and if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my father." Sorry. Okay. As my father, then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. So once they have collected themselves, Joseph gets right to work caring for his family and preparing them to meet Pharaoh. Now, Joseph has spent the last 22 years in Egypt and the last few years under Pharaoh as his second in command. He has learned all about the Egyptian culture. He understands how they think, how they interact with one another, what they expect, and he knows more specifically how the Pharaoh himself thinks and operates. Joseph knows how quickly they changed his appearance, stripped him of what made him unique and different, and quickly tried to conform him to their culture and their standards, right? Remember, they tried to Egyptianize him in a sense. So although they had succeeded in making him look Egyptian, they failed to truly turn him into one of them. Joseph clung to his Hebrew heritage, giving his sons Hebrew names and remembering the one true God and his promise to give them the land of Canaan. So Joseph knows how important it is for his family to be set apart from Egypt to ensure that they too stay true to their Hebrew culture and remain religiously pure and set apart. He does not want his family to be enveloped into Egypt, but wants them to remain set apart. So as Joseph prepares his family to meet Pharaoh, he has a plan. A brilliant plan to make Pharaoh desire to keep his family separate and yet still remain in Pharaoh's good graces. So Joseph tells them that he will lay the groundwork with Pharaoh, letting him know that his family is there with all their livestock and possessions. Joseph is subtly letting Pharaoh know his family are shepherds, but also letting him know they will not be an economic burden to Egypt since they brought all their livestock with them. And their interest in shepherding would discourage any nepotism or attempts to envelop them into the Egyptian culture and nation. He also was subtly telling Pharaoh that Goshen was the best place for his family since it was rich pasture lands and it was on the outskirts of Egyptian society. You see, Joseph knew that Egyptians despised shepherds and refused to associate with them. And so he was going to use that to their advantage in providing for his family and protecting their unique identity. He then tells his brothers that Pharaoh would ask them what their occupation was, and they should answer that they had tended livestock since childhood, just as their fathers did. This is not a new occupation for them, but one that is deeply ingrained in their family. He then explains they will be allowed to stay in Goshen because the Egyptians despise shepherds. I love that he explains why he wants them to do this. He doesn't just tell them what to do and expect them to follow him. He explains why they need to follow his instructions and why they need to say specifically what he tells them to say. So Joseph then goes back to Pharaoh to let him know his family has arrived and subtly lays the groundwork that they are shepherds and that they're already in the land of Goshen, placing the idea of that land in his head. Joseph then artfully only brings with him 5 of his brothers, a much less intimidating representation than all 11 brothers. It also says that he chose the 5. So I'm sure he knew exactly which ones would be able to represent the family well and which ones were too hot-headed and rash to be very good representatives. And things go just as Joseph predicted. Pharaoh asks them what their occupation is, and Joseph's brothers follow Joseph's instructions and say they are shepherds, just as their father had been. But they then go off script and tell Pharaoh they plan to stay a while due to the famine and they would like to stay in Goshen. I wonder if their ad-libbing made Joseph sweat a little bit, make him a little bit nervous as they decided to add their own commentary and their own requests of Pharaoh. He had made out this perfect plan and they were deviating from it. But thankfully, his plan still worked. God was still at work. And so for once, Joseph's brothers were truthful and honest. And Pharaoh rewards them with the best of the land, just as he had promised when he sent them to return for their father. What a contrast to the way Abraham lied when he came to Egypt and was treated poorly because of his lies. Pharaoh had promised Joseph's family could settle in the best of the land and that they could enjoy the fat of the land. And that is exactly what he gives them in the land of Goshen. But he doesn't stop there. He also promises them gainful employment as his superintendents of the royal cattle. Because of Joseph, we see that Pharaoh offers virtually just boundless favor to Jacob's family. Here we see God using not only Joseph, but also Pharaoh to bless and care for Jacob's family as they enter Egypt. Clearly, God is working here. For under normal circumstances, you would never expect such a warm greeting for Jacob's family from the Pharaoh of Egypt, especially once he finds out that they are shepherds. But they're not only given a warm greeting, but blessing and boundless favor. God is setting the stage to do wonderful, amazing things in Jacob's family. So now that went well with his brothers, Joseph brings his father before Pharaoh. Now it's customary to wish a king or Pharaoh a long life with something like, "Long live the king." So we assume that's something of what Jacob said to Pharaoh as he offers him the first of 2 blessings. Jacob does not seem to be intimidated by Pharaoh, but carries himself well and speaks the truth from his heart. By first blessing Pharaoh, he's respectfully recognizing Pharaoh's high position. And then Pharaoh asks him how old he is. Jacob responds truthfully. Now, Jacob's response was probably surprising to Pharaoh, both in its blunt honesty and in Jacob's view of age. For Jacob states that his life has been few and difficult, a mere 130 years, not nearly as long as his father's before him. Now, this was a true statement on Jacob's part, for compared to Abraham, who lived 175 years, and Isaac, who lived 180 years, 130 was rather few. But the Egyptians viewed 110 years as an idealized old age. So to them, 130 was a big deal. And it was true that Jacob's life had been very difficult. But I wonder how many people are that honest and blunt with Pharaoh, saying, "Yeah, my life's been super difficult." So Jacob then goes on to give a second blessing to Pharaoh, which is of great significance. First, Pharaoh had blessed Jacob's family with such great generosity. And so Jacob's blessing was proper, but it also was divinely sanctioned because if you remember back in Genesis 12, as part of the covenant between God and Abraham, God states that Abraham's family would be a blessing to all the families of the earth. So here, between Joseph and Jacob, the promise to Abraham was being fulfilled as we're about to see how God uses Joseph to bless Pharaoh and all of Egypt. And here Jacob himself is blessing Pharaoh as well. Joseph then goes on to settle his father and brothers in Egypt and gives them property in the best part of the land, in Goshen, right where Joseph wanted them to settle. And yet they settle there right where he wanted, but yet it was still under Pharaoh's instructions. It says, in my version, it says the district of Ramses. This is another term that was used to describe the area of Goshen later in history. And so they probably put it in there as the storytelling technique for the those reading it, that they would have a better idea of the area they were referring to. So it's still the land of Goshen. It's just another term for it from later on. And as they settle, we see Joseph provides his entire clan with plenty of food to care for them. God is so good. In the middle of a worldwide famine, Jacob and his sons are given a permanent possession of some of the best land in Egypt. So during a time of great sorrow and starvation, God provides far and above for his people. God is setting them up to flourish and prosper on the outskirts of Egypt. Now that we've seen how God used both Joseph and Pharaoh to prepare them to enter Egypt and settle well, we will now see how God provides for Israel himself. God himself provides Israel to flourish and grow. Does anyone have any comments before we move on?
I just think of the promise or the verse in 25:8, where this contrasts with Abraham, where Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life. To me, that just contrasts so much with what Jacob is saying here. I'm not an old man and my life stinks, or it's not good. It just sets those two in stark comparison. Just a thought.
No, thank you, Deb.
I had a question, and it's a minor little tiny thing that maybe you don't know the answer to. So why is Jacob's name flip-flopping all the time? You know,
Yeah.
I don't know what I first, when I read it, I thought, okay, God is calling him Jacob when he says but it's weird that he says, and God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe it's just they're interchangeable and you get to do whatever you want anytime, or is there significance there? I don't know.
Yeah, I noticed that too. At first I thought it might be that like once he was showing faith, his name switched to Israel, but it then switches back and forth with Jacob and Israel. So I really don't know. No one made a comment about it, which also was surprising to me because I thought that would be an obvious thing to explain. But so I don't know. I don't know if anyone else has a better idea. Unfortunately, the commentaries didn't give me anything.
Okay, thanks.
I know last week the commentaries I read in the end of 45, it starts in what Megan read this morning to start us off, 45:25. They came to their father Jacob, and by the time Moses writes the last verse there in 28, he says then Israel, same thing, flopping back and forth. But the comment from the commentaries there was now they're focusing more on the nation. Here's the nation poised, ready to lead. So
okay,
yeah, I have no idea. Just a thought.
Yep.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Since like he's the figurehead of the nation, so when they're referring specifically to him or him and his yeah. Thank you, Deb. All right, well, let's read. I'm going to read from 13 to 27. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. When the money of the peoples of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is used up." Then bring your livestock, said Joseph. I will sell your food in exchange for your livestock, since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and they gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep and goats, their cattle and donkeys. And he brought them through that year with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was over, they came to him the following year and said, we cannot hide from our Lord the fact that since our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there is nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes? We and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, that the land may not become desolate. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. However, he did not buy the land of the priests because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had food enough from the allotment Pharaoh gave them. That is why they did not sell their land. Joseph said to the people, now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed for you so you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children. You have saved our lives, they said. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph established it as a law concerning land in Egypt, still in force today, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. It was only the land of the priests that did not become Pharaoh's. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Moses takes a quick break from Jacob's family to lay out clearly for us how God uses Joseph to bless Pharaoh and all of Egypt, just as he had promised Abraham. We see Joseph does 4 things for Pharaoh, making him the wealthiest man in the world, and in the process saves all of Egypt from starvation. Once again, we get a glimpse into how truly terrible the famine was all around the region. It says there was no food anywhere in the region. And so Joseph first ends up collecting all the money there was in Egypt and in Canaan for Pharaoh. So then, once all the money was gone, the people came to Joseph and he agrees to accept their livestock in payment. And so he collects all the livestock in Egypt for Pharaoh. Then once their livestock is gone, the people offer themselves and their land up as payment for food so that they do not starve. So Joseph buys up all the land in Egypt, except the priest's land, and he sets up a system of serfdom for all of Egypt. So now Pharaoh owns all the land, and all the people work for Pharaoh. He gives them land and seed, and they will give him a percentage of their crops back to him. Now, at first glance, this seems underhanded and sneaky of Joseph. It really didn't sit well with me that he takes all their stuff for Pharaoh. It seems like he's taking advantage of the people and simply making Pharaoh rich and powerful. But if you look at verse 25, it said, you have saved our lives, they said. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh. The people are grateful. They praise Joseph and they raise him up as a hero. To them, serfdom was way more wonderful an alternative than starvation. So Joseph set them up to be able to work the land. He gave them they kind of had land back then, that they were able to work the land and they were able to care for themselves. And yet they didn't have to worry about starving and dying since they were working for Pharaoh. This also was a very common practice back then. And the percentage that Joseph set up for them to pay back to Pharaoh was actually quite low in the region. 40% was not uncommon in Mesopotamia, and there were some examples in history where even 60% was asked to give back. So making the established set amount 20% was quite quite fair and reasonable of Joseph. So God was using Joseph's shrewdness to bless Pharaoh. He made him probably the wealthiest man in the world. But he also used him to bless all of Egypt, to save all of them from starvation and extinction. And during this time of great famine and devastation, they were able to survive. But we also see then, in great contrast, how God doubly blesses Jacob and his family. God not only brings Jacob and his family to Egypt to protect them from the famine, he blesses them. As all of Egypt and the surrounding areas are selling all of their livestock and all their property and giving everything to Pharaoh, it says the Israelites settled in Goshen and they acquired property. So they actually bought property and had their own property. And they were fruitful and increased greatly in number. So as everyone is selling, they are buying and growing. So now they're set apart even more as they own their own land and are growing as a family. Now, I did not read this anywhere. It's purely my own thoughts. But I had the thought, I wonder if the fact that they own their land was another factor in the future as to why the future Pharaoh was so intimidated by them. Because they grew in vast numbers, but they also owned their land, whereas everyone else worked for Pharaoh. So I don't know if that played a factor, but I thought maybe. So does anyone have any thoughts on that section?
I was just thinking about how, they have been given this job of caring for all of Pharaoh's livestock, and all of a sudden Pharaoh owns all of the livestock. And so actually their job keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which is why they have the money to buy the land, because Pharaoh's paying them to care for his livestock and he has all of the livestock. And so they actually have a job. There's actually a big job for them to do that's just growing over time. And so Pharaoh's paying them for it. And so then they're able to buy land. And that would not have been true there would have been very few jobs left. There's no grain growing. There's nothing growing. No one has livestock anymore. They don't even own their land anymore. And so the Israelites now are the only ones even with a job. And so God has set them up that they arrive right at the time when people still have money. And so they haven't even gotten to the point where they're having to sell their livestock yet. And so they arrive just at the right time. They're set up in place for, they've said to Pharaoh, we're really good shepherds. He says, okay, you can care for them. And then the next year, Joseph buys all the livestock and hands it over to his brothers to manage. And so it's like God timed, of course, in his providence, he times everything perfectly so that they are at just the right time to be ready to receive this big job from Pharaoh.
Yeah, I didn't even register or think about that, but that is so true. That is amazing. Amazing how that works. Thank you. Any other thoughts? All right, does someone want to read the last section for us from 28 to 31?
Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. I will do as you say, he said. Swear to me, he said. And then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff.
Thank you. So as we close the chapter, once again, Jacob is talking about his death. We see that Jacob was blessed to live in Egypt with Joseph for 17 years. Interestingly, Jacob and Joseph had 17 years together before Joseph was sold to Egypt, and now he has 17 more years with Joseph before he dies in Egypt. And as Jacob senses his time is coming to an end, he has Joseph promise to not bury him in Egypt, but to take his body back to Canaan and bury him in the same place as his fathers before him. Interestingly enough, Jacob has Joseph seal the promise in the same way that Abraham had his servant promise to get a wife for Isaac from his family by placing their hand under his thigh. I don't know why I got both these lessons, but I did. Anyways, according to Ligon Duncan, this was a modest way of reminding one of the covenant of circumcision. And so in a way, Jacob is saying to Joseph, do not forget what God has sealed to us in the covenant of circumcision. He has promised us the land and promised to make us a great nation. And so do not bury me here. Jacob knows that when he dies, he will be reunited with his fathers. So he's not concerned about being left behind in that sense, but he wants his body also to be joined with them in the promised land and his physical body not left behind in Egypt. Jacob's once again showing his faith and trust in the Lord to fulfill his promise and bring them out of Egypt and back to the promised land. Jacob has Joseph double swear to him to take his body so he cannot back down, placing Joseph under God's wrath if he were to go back on his promise. So what great growth we have seen in the life of Jacob. McGee points out that the life of Jacob can be divided into 3 geographical locations: Haran, Canaan, and Egypt. And each of these locations denotes a different spiritual level. First, we see Jacob in Haran. He's God's man, but he is running. Next, we see Jacob in Canaan. He's still God's man, but he's fighting in his own strength. And now, last we see him in Egypt. He's still God's man, but now he is not walking in his own strength or running away, but he is now walking by faith. Each of those places, God reiterates to Jacob that he is with him. All along the way, God was with Jacob, providing for him, caring for him, and blessing him. And yet, it's not until the very end when Jacob goes to Egypt that we see him truly walking by faith and trusting in God and his promises. What an amazing testament to God's faithfulness, love, and care for his people. He chose the Israelites to be his people. He chose Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob to be his chosen people. And now we see that God chose to use Joseph, and even the pagan Pharaoh to help bless and protect his people. God, in all his sovereignty, purposely placed Jacob's family in the land of Goshen to protect them and to prosper them. And as Hughes says it so perfectly, what a grace the Ark of Egypt was. There at the fertile borders of Egypt, the people of Israel benefited from the prosperity and protection of Egypt without surrendering their distinctives. There they honed their spiritual and national identity. There they grew from a mere handful to a great nation. So what an amazing God we serve. A God who not only loved and chose the Israelites to be his people, but who also chose each of us to be his chosen people as well. God loves each one of us and works in each of our lives to protect us and place us in the best situation to prosper and flourish as well. It may not always seem like the best situation. If you think about the Israelites, God used slavery and persecution as a way to help them grow down the way, and I'm sure they would not have thought of that as a blessing. But God was with them, and God was working then too. And in the same way, I bet each of us can look back at our lives and see ways that God was working to grow us, protect us, and help us flourish. So I want us each just to take a moment and ask God to open your eyes to times in your past when he has specifically been working to prepare you and grow you. So I'll give you just a few minutes to think about it. And then if anyone wants to share, I can share while you guys are thinking. I know Jared and we often talk about our time in Ohio as a time that God used to grow us. So before we came to Bethel, God moved us out to Ohio for a part-time youth pastor position, and it was a very long, difficult 2 years. Yet we can look back and we clearly see so many ways that God used that time to grow us as both parents and in ministry and in so many different ways. We're very thankful for that time. Maddie had just been born a week before you moved out. So we were brand new parents and moved 7 hours away from both of our parents. And so we're really thankful that we had that time of great distance to be able to learn how to parent and what we wanted our family to look like and how we wanted to operate as a family away from both of our families, because we're very close with them and we both look up to our parents a lot. And so it was good for us to have to figure it out on our own for a few years first. And we're very thankful for that. But then we're thankful that God brought us back. So now we're close to our parents who can help us and encourage us now that we have our own foundation. We're also think back and remember we can see many times that God used it to grow us in ministry. He revealed to us a lot of our own weaknesses, our own strengths, and we were able to learn a lot about ourselves and a lot about what we need, and a lot about what ministry shouldn't look like. And so we're very thankful for that time that God used to grow us a lot and prepare us for our time here at Bethel. And so it's really encouraging when you can look back and see that God was with you in tough times and that God was using them to prepare you. Does anyone else have any that they thought of that they would like to share? I know I put everyone right on the spot, but.
I would like to.
All right, go for it.
I can see God working through my whole life, because of circumstances in my family. I could see the death of, I had a 13-month-old sister, and I was almost 6, she passed away. And so that was one of the things that started my thoughts towards God and heaven. My father was also alcoholic, and my mother was a woman of faith. So she would talk about having faith in God, and everything in her life was God focused. I mean, she focused on her family too, and being in church and serving God, and knowing the Lord. And then there were other circumstances when I lost 2 children. I feel that God used that to draw me. And I hate to say this, but I went through a divorce, and that showed me that my dependence had to be on the Lord. And then I got to adopt 2 children, and I thank God for them. And then I lost my husband 2.5 years ago. And that also, again, God used that in my life to show me that for me, I could look for love and confidence in people when I can't. I have to depend on the Lord each and every day for everything in my life, because I also lost my job. And so God's showing me how he provides each and every day, and that I need to be thankful to him and just praise and worship him each and every day. So I'm so grateful that that Wilma told me about your study. And then I'm involved with some other studies, but I praise God that he is always there, and he never leaves me or forsakes me, even when I may not like the circumstances. Like you said, he's used everything to bring me to him. And I know that, one day I'm going to be with him in glory. So these trials are just, they're temporary, like he said. And like I said, I just praise God that he is working in my life, that he loves me too much to leave me the way I am. So thank you for letting me share.
Thank you so much for sharing, Brenda. We really appreciate hearing your testimony.
Thank you. Thank God.
Yes. So any other last thoughts or testimony? All right. Well, I want to challenge us all to take time to really think through and just realize ways that God's been working in your life. And if you have someone you can share it with, because it's always encouraging to hear other people's testimonies and hear how God is working in their lives. It's just so neat the more we learn about God and his love, like we learned on Sunday, and his sovereign work in our lives. What a blessing we have. So I'm going to close us in prayer, and then I hope you all have a really great week. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you for our opportunity to gather here on Zoom, that we can still study your word, even though some of us have been sick, Lord. And I just thank you for your word and the truth it has, Lord. I thank you that it's alive and we can learn more things all the time from it. Thank you for each of these ladies. Help them to be encouraged and strengthened today, and remind us this week of the many ways that you have been working and are still working in our lives right now, Lord. I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.